So we're going to continue our commentary on Mark. I guess this is session 28. We're still on chapter 6. We covered the visit to Nazareth by Jesus, the mission of the 12 after uh, the rejection in Nazareth, perhaps related, and then the short piece on Herod speculating as to who this miracle worker is, and he sort of concludes that John, whom he beheaded, has risen from the dead. And so now we get to the account of the death of the Baptist, a very famous account. Obviously, the movies have a field day with Salome dancing and Herodias, the evil mother, um, and all that. Uh, I'm interested in addressing the thorny uh, text, and more than anything, to say something else again about a hypothesis or theory that I hold to, that Mark is allergic to politics, and that he probably rightfully so. I think Mark has a good chance of having been written in Rome. I believe he was written before the year 70. It would be hard to argue that he was written before 66. Most scholars give it a date around 70, the destruction of the temple. 66 is the beginning of the Jewish war against the Romans. So that I think there's a very good chance, just from what the scholars say about dating, that when Mark was written, maybe in Rome, probably in Rome, the fact that the Christians were incredibly unpopular. Nero's fire, I think, was in 64. There is this sort of tantalizing, or whatever you want to call it, line in Mark 9:49. All of you will be salted with fire. And of course, there's plenty of talk of persecution in this gospel. So that the argument that Mark was written in Rome to Roman Christians, incredibly unpopular with the Romans, following a crucified insurgent, you're, you don't have to be paranoid. You're not paranoid if everybody's after you, and to be allergic to politics in that situation is quite understandable. So Mark goes out of his way to depoliticize Jesus. And this is really, in large part, the beginning of this blame only the Jews for the death of Jesus. And in fact, in Mark's version of the condemnation of Jesus by Pilate, it says that Pilate realized it was out of envy that the leaders were delivering Jesus, the high priests, the Sadducees, not even the Pharisees, but the high priests, who were in great cahoots with the Roman procurator, governor, prefect, whatever the correct title for Pontius Pilate is. The people are in favor of Jesus. They're afraid to arrest Jesus because the crowd loves him. Let's get that very clear. And so, but unfortunately, and since we need to think and we don't, the fact that the gospel is written in this way and then taken up in large part by Matthew, who says, "Let his blood be on us and our children," etc. And in John, you have the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. Everybody's Jewish in the Gospel of John. But this becomes a term for characters in this drama in the Gospel of John. And all this stuff is somewhat sophisticated. if you don't think about these things, you could become uh, anti-Semitic and all this other stuff. Um, so that um, regarding this incident of John the Baptist and Herod, we have a situation here. Um, I'm going to put up the excerpt from Josephus, the Jewish historian, very famous, who deals with John the Baptist more at length than he does with Jesus. And he deals with Jesus before he deals with John the Baptist, very briefly, and does not link Jesus to John the Baptist. So that's a topic for another session at some point. But it's incredibly complicated. This late Hellenistic history, with the Maccabee dynasty, and then with Herod the Great and his sons, it's all incredibly complicated and convoluted. And I'm not gonna try to sort it out. But you do have this certainly a marriage between one of Herod's sons and um, a woman that then goes over to a half brother of Herod. And rather than confuse myself and confuse you, I'm just going to read two commentaries from two good Bibles that I follow. So obviously in Mark, let's go back to Mark 1 second. It says that, after Herod has been mentioned as beheading John, now Mark has to explain, how that came to be. He's blurted it out, so to speak, before even talking about or narrating the death of John the Baptist. So that he says that at this time Herod uh, had John arrested and imprisoned because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. And probably that's not correct. His brother was not Philip. I'll address that, but we're not going to solve this here. My point is going to be another. For John the Baptist had told Herod, it is against the law for you to have your brother's wife. So let's leave it at that, but let's see what these notes have to say. One note in the New American Bible says Herodias was not the wife of Herod's half-brother Philip, but of another half-brother, Herod Boethus. So if we go back to Josephus, you'll see that he calls everybody Herod, and this is where some of the confusion lies. According to Josephus, oh, by the way, the union was prohibited by Leviticus 18:16 and 20:21. So this would be one of these consanguinity prohibitions, too close blood relatives, which is really what's behind this. In case of porneia, zenut, prostitution, meaning the rabbis would consider marrying too close a relative as a form of prostitution. And so that's what the Matthew exception to divorce has to do with, using the Greek porneia, which is immorality sort of generally, but refers specifically to this prohibition of consanguinity. And I think my time is going to run out before long. But anyway, according to Josephus, Antiquities, what we're looking at here, Herod imprisoned and then executed John because he feared that the Baptist's influence over the people might enable him to lead a rebellion. So that's what we're going to look at, however briefly. The other note, just to say something about this whole issue of who was this guy that Herod had stolen the wife from. The Jerusalem Bible, on the note to Matthew 14:3, says that the Vulgate omits Philip, which is what Mark calls, the brother who lost the wife, um, so that in he had uh, taken the wife of his brother Philip, but the Vulgate omits Philip because it's a name that offers difficulty, says the Bible. This figure is not the tetrarch of Iturea and of Trachonitis, but rather another son of Herod the Great, who he had with Mary Am the second. These are Maccabee dynasty princes that Herod, the half-Jew, married into to legitimize his, you know, uh, right to rule over the Jews. He was really from Idumea, Edom, kind of like recently converted sort of half-Jews. That's why he also built the temple, rebuilt it so big and glorious. This was a stepbrother, therefore, of Antipas. The Herod in question here is Antipas, the one who beheads John, and whom Josephus also calls Herod. His status as a normal bloke, I'm translating from the Spanish here, had not satisfied the ambitions of his wife Herodias, who in turn was the granddaughter of Herod the Great. That's a big one. By her father Aristobulus, and therefore she was the niece of Antipas. That's the relationship. She's the niece of Antipas, to whom she preferred to her too modest uncle. And so the crime of Antipas was rather in having married his niece than having taken her from her living brother, and furthermore, without himself having dismissed or repudiated his first wife. So it's a little complicated, but the point, I think, is that you have always a wiggle room to justify the biblical text. I want to make that clear. Whether Philip is the right name or not, I don't know. It could be a manuscript issue that we have to deal with, although I think all the manuscripts are going to have Philip, all the good manuscripts. The Vulgate would be a little bit later, but it might be relying on, you know, um, early valuable manuscripts that simply didn't copy this Philip. Um, in any case, I assume that the Philip is in the Gospel of Mark. But the point is that what we know from Josephus is that John the Baptist had great influence over the people, and that Herod sort of made a preemptive strike against John the Baptist to avert a rebellion. And so I think we can say that he's found a very interesting way of explaining why and how John came to be executed. And that has to do with this banquet, one of these topics in Mark, they like the first place in the banquets, etc. And a dance. He uses the expression in Greek, the little girl. The little girl brought the tray to her mother, which is very sort of a tender thing. This little girl has been used kind of to comply with this evil, ambitious Herodias mother's wishes. And so they buried John the Baptist. But you see, if you read this chapter 5 or the other numbering that's used now in Josephus's Antiquities, you'll find that Macaris is mentioned in both instances, this prison nearby, etc. And so you have definitely a historical like account taking place, but not necessarily strictly to the letter. And I'll stop there. We'll have to continue with the multiplication of the loaves sometime later.